Hello, everyone. This is chapter 10, but before I get started, I wanted to explain a few things that have been going on. Firstly, I got a new microphone, so we're going to test it and see how this turns out. Secondly, as you might have noticed, or maybe you didn't, my voice has been changing due to me being on testosterone. This means that some of the voices that I do, I may not be able to do quite as well, or my voice may crack a little more than you're used to. In this situation, you are fully allowed to make fun of my voice cracking, but please be understanding if I do it during a line. I'm I don't have unlimited amounts of time, so what's probably going to happen is there will be some, and I'll try to keep it to a minimum, but I really can't help it, and I'll get caught off guard myself. It also doesn't help that I was doing some eccentric voices last night, so we'll see how it goes. Anyway, I hope you understand, and I hope you enjoy Chapter 10. Their presence, Anne and her had decided to give her some space and a doctor. Anne, however, had taken that one step further. Upon exiting the cell, she hadn't said a word, simply stood in silence until the doctor that Marcy had called for arrived. Then, without so much as a backwards glance, she followed him back to Sasha's cell. Marcy would have been more concerned if she wasn't convinced that Sasha was more of a danger to herself at this point. What happened? The sound of her own voice startles her. She nearly jumps out of her own skin, clapping a hand to her mouth and stopping dead in her tracks. Her eyes close, and a sigh leaves her body. In all of her time knowing Sasha, she had never ever seen something like this. She knew that the nature of her and Sasha's relationship meant that she wasn't exactly privy to her more vulnerable moments. But as far as she'd known, Sasha didn't have vulnerable moments. She was the unconquerable mountain, with an ego twice as big as was advisable, and a thick enough skin to match. She'd never seen her so much as wince before, much less break down in tears or tremble like a leaf in the wind. The closest she'd ever gotten was when she'd cut off Anne's hand. Marcy doesn't remember most of what had happened after that. Anger, nay, fury, had washed down her spine and taken her body hostage, left her nothing but a slave to the adrenaline. She knows that she'd attacked Sasha, that words had been exchanged, but the majority of the encounter remained a blur, one that she didn't really care to unravel. She had gotten Anne out of there, that was all that mattered. If she said something cruel or hurt Sasha in the moment, well, then she more than deserved it at the time. Did that make her as bad as Sasha? That she'd let her emotions get the better of her and perhaps inflicted some serious and lasting damage as a result? Maybe. Or had something else happened? She starts pacing again. The records that she'd found in the palace hadn't exactly painted a very flattering picture of the commander of the Toad Army. Commander Grime was said to be a man with short stature and even shorter temper. While Sasha had a knack for navigating anything and everything social, even she had her limits. Was it possible that Commander Grime had taken Sasha's actions? Or perhaps he'd ordered them? It wasn't like they knew what Sasha had been doing in the sewers in the first place, or why she'd targeted Anne in anything other than a personal grudge. Was it possible that Grime had cited Anne as a potential threat and ordered her elimination or capture? If that was the case, then Sasha's failure to complete the mission could have resulted in some strict reprimands. It would explain the reaction to her touch, the flinch and the tears. not to mention the account for the startling amount of scars and bruises that she'd seen. A frown pulls at the corner of her mouth. It was plausible, perhaps even likely, but it didn't account for everything. Last Anne had told her, Sasha held a pretty high position in the Toad Army, to the point that Grime had saved her what probably would have been a fatal fall. Even if Sasha had failed her mission, if he had gone through the trouble to save her before, why punish her now? Occam's razor, perhaps? What was the simpler explanation for why someone like Sasha would suddenly become a weeping, shaking mess at the slightest touch? Trauma of some sort, of course. The question was then, was the reaction reserved for Marcy alone, or not? If it was, then it had to do with whatever had happened after she'd cut off Anne's hand. If it wasn't, then something else happened. She nods to herself. She'd have to test that. The sound of a door opening roused her from her musings. Anne slid through it, a troubled expression on her face and a furrow in her brow that looked far too comfortable there for someone who used to smile so often. Marcy's pacings come to an abrupt halt. Is she okay? It wasn't the first thought that ran through her mind, but it somehow ends up being the one that escapes her. Anne's expression quickly morphs to one of surprise when confronted by Marcy's concerned tone. Then it sinks back down into a troubled frown. The doctor says she'll be fine as long as she doesn't pick at it anymore. She says the words robotically, like they're an afterthought to whatever is racing in her head. He's instructing the guards to keep an eye on her and to make sure her bandages are changed at least twice a day. Marcy nods, but that only really partially answers her question. She's calmed down, then? Anne stares at her a moment. Something in her expression is confused, though Marcy isn't entirely sure why. Finally, after an extended moment of silence, she shakes her head, disbelieving. Marcy, what the fuck? Marcy blinks like she's been struck between the eyes. Pardon? What the fuck? Anne repeats like that clarifies anything. When Marcy remains mystified, she lets out a sigh that sounds more like a trumpet blast. She spins on her foot and marches back to the door, clicking it shut with a bit more force than necessary, then whirls back on Marcy, her arms spread for effect. What the living hell is going on with you? Marcy is still confused. What's going on with her? What? Anne looks ready to pull her hair out, though she can't decide if that's her own hair or Marcy's. This whole... She waves her arms wildly, which is about how Marcy feels right now. Weird-ass mood swing you've got going on. Well, now Marcy is really confused. She feels her head cocking to the side before she even thinks to do it. Mood swing? She mutters. And since when did you curse so much? Not important. Anne waved off the second question. What is important is the fact you go from being lovable goofball I know to heartless soldier I've never seen before at the drop of the hat. What the actual hell, Marcy? Marcy blinks rapidly. What are you talking about? Anne stares at her like she's just claimed to not know what the sun is. Are you serious? It's all the warning she gets before Anne advances on her, and on more than instinct than anything else, she goes stumbling back. She barely gets 3 steps before Anne grabs her by the wrist and wrenches her forwards. She freezes instinctually, and Anne takes the opportunity to reach into her cloak. Her hand reemerges with a dagger, and her expression could be described as disappointed, but not surprised. For some reason, that makes Marcy feel worse than anger would have. Remind me what you agreed when we walked in here. Sheepish, and more than a bit ashamed, Marcy bows her head. Leaving my weapons in the locker room. And what is this? Anne holds up the dagger with thinly veiled dismay. A dagger. Anne drops the blade and only barely flinches when it clatters against the stone. Having illustrated her point, she crosses her arms over her chest. Sasha needs support right now, not someone who might turn a dime and stab at her in the moment she does anything that might be considered threatening. Now it's Marcy's turn to stare at Anne like she's grown a second head.
What do you take me for? She splutters, offended. I'd never...
Then why did you bring the dagger after I specifically told you that I didn't think it was a good idea? Anne cuts her off.
And then what was that in the cell?
Her hand rises in a finger quote.
It's in your best interest to be cooperative, otherwise I can't guarantee your safety.
Marcy finds herself taking a step back without her input. Had she actually said that? She remembers that they'd argued, remembers that something very hot and very tight had taken refuge in her throat upon entering the prison. But she didn't remember saying that. Suddenly, the dagger she has hidden as a precaution felt an awful lot more like a threat.
What?
Anne snaps, hand snapping up and forward until a finger had planted itself directly into her chest.
You what? What could you possibly think justified? She cut off your hand, Anne.
Marcy snaps back. The words tasted bitter. It felt wrong to shout at Anne, even like this. Especially like this.
You can't just forget that. She's dangerous. She's a teenager.
Anne shoves her, pushes her against her armor so she's forced to stumble back into the wall.
Just like we are. She made a mistake, yes, but we can't just... A mistake?
Marcy doesn't like this. She doesn't want this. She wants to stop. She doesn't want to fight with Anne. It feels wrong. It makes her feel ill, sick even. But something in her throat, something tight and hot and painful, won't let Anne just let it go.
She cut off your hand.
Her legs are moving, advancing on Anne, but Anne stands her ground even in her intensity.
You are never getting that back. Never! You are going to live with that for the rest of your life.
So does she. Anne's expression is stone. An acceptance that is almost resignation had carved it just so. I know what she did, Marcy. Trust me, I do. But I choose not to let it rule me. She lifts her left arm, and the empty space at the end feels like a knife in Marcy's chest. This isn't worth losing her. That tight, hot thing in her chest seizes.
But you are?
The words left her lips, but they sound off. Dangerously soft and fragile considering their context. Anne looks like she's been struck. What? Marcy's eyes sting, but it's an afterthought. Her throat is burning, her hands are shaking, and that hot thing in her chest is trying its damnedest to escape. Do you know how you got out of the sewers, Anne? Why is her voice like that? Anne still looks confused, blindsided, really. She trails off and her face contorts in realization. I don't remember. Marcy feels herself nod. She expected that. Sprig came to me, she starts, and said that you'd gone running off in the sewers after something. I followed and I found you just before she... A dawning horror is mounting in Anne's eyes. Marcy, I carried you back. Marcy doesn't let her speak. No, the heat in her chest wouldn't let her. Not before. I walked back with your barely conscious, bleeding, broken body draped over my shoulder. Marcy.
I held you.
She spits the words and something wet runs down her face.
I held you as we walked and you cried over her.
She can't see Anne's face. Her vision is too blurry. Her eyes are too raw.
You were dying.
Everything is too raw. It feels like your body is coming apart at its seams and she's powerless to stop it.
You were bleeding to death in my arms and you cried for her.
Marcy's legs give out. She falls to her knees and vaguely. She feels the sting of metal biting into her knees, but she doesn't care. She's crying. Her body is racked with sobs as moments Flashes play over in her mind's eye. Anne sobbing as her entire front was covered in blood. Blood-soaked bandages that she pulled tight with her trembling fingers, screams in the hospital as a fire poker was pressed against the torn flesh in order to burn it closed. The scent of burning flesh. The blood on her own hands as she scrubbed it for hours on end. Trying to sleep and only managing to cry as the scent of iron refused to leave her. Marcy cries and cries and cries. She cries until she can't anymore. Until all of her tears have dried and her throat is raw. Until her face feels trapped from the tears and she's left hollow and empty. At some point, Anne had sunken down to meet her. She'd wrapped her arms around Marcy's shaking shoulders and held her close as she'd poured out every last grain of grief and hurt out of herself. Anne, who'd lost a hand, who'd walked those catacombs with her, who was the one who had been burned, who'd bled, who had lost, and lost, and lost, held her. Marcy would have cried again if she could have. But the tears had left her, leaving behind an exhausted teenager who felt too weak to even move in the armor on her shoulders. Her head lands in the crook of Anne's neck, and she drinks in the familiar scent. Whatever little comforts she can get, whatever she can hold on to. Her hands have balled themselves in the fabric of Anne's shirt, and she doesn't have the wherewithal to uncurl them. I can't lose you. Anne's grip tightens for a moment, and Marcy tries not to revel in how good it feels to be held. You won't. She whispers into the crown of her head. The sound vibrates down her spine, and somehow another few errant tears manage to escape down her face. I love you. Marcy isn't sure where the words come from, but she knows them to be true. They've always been true in one sense or another. And as her best friend, her only friend, she's always loved her, and always will for that, but this is different. This isn't the same kind of love she's used for years. It's the one you can say with a smile or use as a reply to a particularly mean joke or violent wrestling session. This is the kind that takes refuge in her chest and it burns. It's the kind that encompasses your entire being, that wrestles control from your hands and leaves you helpless. It's the kind that she's only read of in storybooks. The kind that hurts. Anne's arms, still wrapped around her, shake. I know. Anne whispers. Do you? Marcy wonders. They're halfway back to the Planners Hotel before Marcy even registers where they are. She's been in a haze ever since that conversation in the prison, relying on Anne's gentle guiding hands and soft words for function. It should be mildly disturbing that she can shut down like that, but Marcy finds she doesn't have it within herself to care. Everything still feels a little distant. Her eyes still burn from unshed tears. Her stomach is sore. Her chest aches with each breath. However, with her head still resting in the crook of Anne's neck, she feels strands of her hair being tugged at, and a weight that has settled around her shoulders. She's comfortable. She never wants the carriage ride to end. Anne is humming under her breath, a song that Marcy doesn't remember the name or the words to, but she would bet on the same being true for Anne, and the tune is familiar, so she lets herself relax into it, into Anne. The weight around her shoulders shifts, stroking up her arm and back down comfortingly. She can feel her eyelids drooping. I'll wake you up when we get there, Anne assures, somehow aware of her plight, and Marcy can't stop the ragged laugh from pushing out of her throat. It's not that far, she argues. Anne just hums, non-committal. Regardless, the swaying of the carriage, the warmth of Anne's body, and the gentle tugs at her hair slowly lull her to sleep. A gentle prodding at her side rouses her, but she's already out of the carriage and standing in an elevator before she actually manages to wrestle her way into wakefulness. The hotel is the best in the city, and Marcy knows it well from her own brief stint within its walls, plus all of the extra trips escorting the Planners from it to the hospital and back. But somehow, perhaps it's the rays of a dying sunset struggling its way through the large windows. It looks different. There's something final? No, foreboding in the air. something that makes the tired feeling in her bones shrink to make way for the lighter and more familiar weight of anxiety. Anne stands beside her, left arm wrapped around Marcy's waist, and Marcy finds herself reaching for a hand that isn't there to hold. A breath escapes her and it tastes sour. Anne, what am I? Shh. Anne admonishes, not even turning to face her. When Marcy's brows knit in response, all she receives in reply is a gentle nudge. The elevator doors open, and without any heed to Marcy's silent protest, Anne drags her through the wide, gilded golden halls. They come upon a warm wooden door, and Anne tugs out a key to open the lock. Her left arm never leaves Marcy. With the door open, Anne escorts her inside and gently clicks it closed behind the two of them. Anne, I should really go back to the... Marcy tries again, but Anne silences her with her hand, gently resting it on her shoulder. Her face is tired. Her eyes are bleeding. Stay. The word is barely a whisper. Marcy blinks. The hand on Marcy's shoulder slides down to take her hand instead. Her eyes never leave Marcy's. Please? Whatever sense of foreboding that had been in the air dissipates with the single word. It's strange, she thinks as they prepare for bed. Most people their age have sleepovers, and they've certainly had their fair share, but when they've been in the human world. But this is so much different from any form of sleepover she might have had before. For one, there's no Sasha. For another, they're actually planning on sleeping. And for third, there's something intimate about it. Marcy had been with Anne without her armor before, but she's never taken it off while in her presence. The feeling of the familiar weight leaving her shoulders is accompanied with a gentle pat on her shoulder and a set of generic hotel brand sleeping clothes shoved into her arms. They crawl into Anne's bed without so much as another word exchanged between them. And when Anne's arms find their way around Marcy's middle, she doesn't stop to question it for even a moment. It's not like her bed in the palace, the one covered in notebooks, quills, bottles of ink, and other assorted books she'd snuck in there from the library. It's been a very long time since Marcy has slept in a bed, and even longer one since she slept in a bed that didn't randomly stab her at some point during the night. Anne's warmth at her side should be alien, but it isn't. It isn't even uncomfortable. The chill of winter has all but set in at this point, and Marcy knows from several records she's read on the subject, it's only a matter of time before snow appears. Anne has always been a bit warmer than most, and right now, it's the best thing to warm off the cold. It feels warm, comfortable, safe. Marcy hasn't felt safe since falling into Amphibia. It's a startling realization, and perhaps she should have had it a while ago. Even in the palace, surrounded by guards and with the king's assurances, she hadn't felt safe. Nothing felt safe. She remembers the dagger she snuck into Sasha's chamber. Was that it? The reason for all her new and strange behaviors? The reason that she could look at someone she'd known for almost her entire life and see a threat before she saw anything else? Fear? Her hands come up to grip onto Anne's arms, and behind her she hears a quiet sigh. You're thinking too loud, Anne whispers. Marcy wants to laugh, but the motion won't come. That's all I ever do, she says instead. Anne does manage a laugh and heads the back of Marcy's shoulder affectionately. For an extended moment, that seems to be the end of it. Anne's breaths are even against Marcy's neck, and the last dying rays of the sun have long since fallen below the horizon, leaving the room dark with the only city lights below to light it. Marcy makes it halfway to drifting off before Anne speaks again. Her voice is incredibly soft. I'm going back to Wortwood. Like an anvil falling from the sky, the foreboding crashes over her. What? Anne's arms tighten. She can feel the notches of her spine pressing against the front of Anne's nightshirt. Anne's breath goes over the back of her neck when she speaks. While you were unconscious, King Andreas had a breakthrough. The arms wrapped around her middle squeezed gently. He wanted to just send the planners to go get the Calamity Box, but I volunteered to go with them. There's something terribly tired in Anne's voice, and Marcy has a sneaking suspicion it has nothing to do with the day they've had. She turns in Anne's hold, receiving a displeased grumble for her trouble. By the time she's turned to face her, Anne's face is halfway to a scowl. Why didn't you tell you earlier? Anne cuts in, before smiling a sardonic smile. Well, for one, we already had enough to deal with at the time, and for another. Anne's right arm lifts so she can trail her hand up Marcy's side to rest against her cheek. I didn't want you to try to talk me out of it. Marcy blinks, dumbstruck. You would. Anne doesn't let her even start. Her eyes are on her, but they won't meet her gaze. You want to, now, I can tell. Marcy can't really argue at that point. I just got you back, she decides on, and carefully reaches her own hand to take the one resting on her cheek. Anne lets her. And we're in the middle of a war. It's not safe to travel right now, and You don't need me. Anne cuts her off again. The hand in hers tightens into a fist. A deep breath is pulled into her chest. And I don't need you. Something shatters inside of Marcy's chest, but Anne isn't done speaking. I like you, I want you, and I trust you, but I don't need you. The hand held in Marcy's gradually loosens before turning to lace its fingers between Marcy's. You are the most important person in my life right now, and that's why I need to go. Anne's eyes open once more, and somehow, in the darkened room, they seem infinite. Twin black holes staring her down, staring through her, right into her soul. I can't need you, and you can't need me. This is a dangerous game to play, and I refuse to even start it with you. You've been there for me when I needed you to be, and for that I'm so grateful, but I need a break from all this. Marcy has never felt so lost. I don't understand. She feels like she's being pulled in 100 different ways at once, and she can't seem to remember which way is up and which is down. Did I do something wrong? There is something so terribly pained in Anne's eyes. Maybe. That was not the answer she was hoping to hear. Maybe not, she continues. That's not for me to decide. What? She splutters. How am I supposed to fix this if I don't even know if I've done anything wrong? Anne shrugs. I don't know, and that's why I have to go. Okay, now Marcy is really confused. I don't... Think of it like this. Anne sits up a little more. Just props herself up on her elbow, before releasing her grasped hand in gesture. In Avatar The Last Airbender, before Prince Zuko joins the gang, he has to go off on his own for a while, without even his Uncle Iroh, in order to figure out some stuff and find himself as a person. Marcy feels her brow furrowing. But he only has to do that so he can see that all he ever wanted is pointless given the horrors he's seen, and so he can confront Ozai one last time to finish his redemption arc. Look, I'm not saying it's a perfect analogy. Anne holds up her hand placatingly. What I am saying is that I need time to process. A lot has happened over the past 2 months. I need a break. Plus, with Sasha here, the Toad Army has come to a standstill. Grime won't make a move unless his precious lieutenant is in the line of fire. It's the best chance we're gonna get in order to go for the Calamity Box. Marcy tries her hardest to digest that. So, you're going back to Wartwood in order to take a break from everything going on with the war? Anne makes an interesting face. Partially, she concedes. Marcy nods. Okay, when do we leave? The sad glint in Anne's eyes is back. No. Marcy is confused again. No? No. Anne agrees. I am leaving tomorrow morning. You are staying here. Marcy gives Anne another dumbfounded look. Are you mad at me? Is this about the whole thing with Sasha earlier? Look, Anne, I'm sorry, but I just can't forgive. Anne places her finger over Marcy's moving lips, effectively silencing her. I'm not mad at you. Her voice is just fond enough to convince her of it. And this is only partially about the thing with Sasha earlier. Marcy's getting kind of tired of these cryptic assurances. She grabs Anne's hand away from her mouth and tries her hardest not to pout. Then spell it out. I'm not good at picking up on subtext. You know this. The side of Anne's mouth quirks up for a second before smoothing back down. I'm worried about you. Oh. Oh? She questions. Anne sighs. Marcy, you haven't been yourself lately, even ignoring the whole thing at the prison. There's also your increased insomnia. These past 2 months have been bad for me, and I doubt they've been any better for me. For you. You need a break. We need a break. So, I made a deal with King Andreas. Marcy isn't sure she likes the sound of that. What deal? Anne gives her a look that feels almost as intimate as taking off her armor did. You're on leave until I get back. No work. Anne somehow still manages to blindside her, no matter how much she thinks she's figured her out at this point. But, no buts. Anne's gaze turns stern. King Andros already approved it. Marcy feels herself pouting before she can even try and start it. What the hell am I supposed to do while you're gone, then? Relax, Anne answers as if it's the most obvious answer. Go on a walk, read a book for fun instead of research, draw, learn a new board game. I don't know, just take a break. Marcy doesn't take breaks. Even back home, when she wasn't doing schoolwork, she was grinding in a video game or researching whatever strange topic had caught her fancy that week, or working on creating a scale model of the Eiffel Tower out of Legos, or some other project. Breaks do not exist. They can't exist. What about you? She protests. I can't get to take a break while you, go on a perilous journey across the countryside? Anne laughs. She actually laughs. It's enough to get some of the incredulity to loosen from Marcy's chest. I like to think of it more as a family vacation, she says when she's regained her breath. Besides, I haven't really gotten to have any quality time with the planners since... She gestures with her left arm. Marcy frowns. Anne sighs and gently snakes her arms back around Marcy's middle. I didn't mean to turn this into a big discussion, she mutters softly. This is going to be the last night we have together for a bit. I'm going to miss you. Then why are you going? She wants to argue. But she keeps this to herself. Instead, she turns in Anne's hold once more, nestling back into the crook of her neck. Come back in one piece, she whispers. Anne chuckles. A bit late for that. She licks Anne's neck. A squeak answers her, and Anne tries to pull away, but Marcy holds on tight, not letting her escape. After a few moments of wriggling, Anne gives up, falling back against the bed with a frustrated huff. "You're a jerk," she mutters. "No, you. No, you. No, you. No, you. You." Marcy counters, but it's more of a mumble. "Mm-hmm." Anne hums intelligently. Marcy is already asleep.